Hi, I'm Kristen, and I'm an engineer with National Instruments, and I'm here to show you how to use flow control with TestStand test management software. Flow control describes a set of test steps in TestStand that allow you to introduce if, then, for, and other branching logic into your test sequence. This is useful so that you can decide which steps you want to execute based on a condition set. So I already have TestStand open, and I'm looking at one of our shipping examples, the computer motherboard test sequence. So I've made some modifications to this test sequence to actually take out the flow control that comes with the shipping example, just so that we can see how to introduce these into a test sequence. This example has a number of test steps to simulate testing on our computer motherboard. Notice we have a power-up test and some tests on additional peripherals like our keyboard. If we think about it, it doesn't make much sense to test our keyboard if the device can't even power on. So this would be a great place to introduce some flow control, such that if our power-up test fails, we can actually skip these additional test steps. I can access my flow control steps in the flow control folder in my insertion palette. And I'll go ahead and select an if statement. I'm going to drag that if statement just after my power-up test. And in my step settings pane down below, I have the ability to set a conditional expression for this if statement. If the power-up test step fails, I'm going to want to skip some of the remaining test steps. A great way to monitor my power-up test would be to monitor the overall sequence failed variable, because we know if our power-up test fails, I'm going to have a failed test and therefore a failed sequence. For my conditional expression, I'll obtain a reference to the current sequence and then the sequence failed variable. The next thing I'll do is drag the end of this if statement just after my keyboard test. So now this block says only execute these 4 tests if my power-up test has not failed. Now, we're not quite done here. We do have a power-up diagnostics test, and that would probably be good to execute if my power-up test does fail. So I'm going to introduce some additional flow control. I'm going to drag an else statement and place that around my power-up diagnostics test. Then I'm going to move my end statement to just after my power-up diagnostics test. So now this block says if my power-up test step does not fail, execute the remaining tests. Else, if it does fail, just execute my power diagnostics test. You can also modify execution flow in TestStand to actually execute a different sequence within your sequence file. So note that we have a CPU test sequence which contains 4 tests relevant to our CPU. So we can branch our execution to this other sequence using a sequence call step. In my step settings pane, I'll select to load sequences from the current sequence file, and then I'll select my CPU test sequence. I'll need to pass in any relevant parameters that this sequence will need. Now, this is just a quick example of flow control in TestStand. There's more that we can do to modify the way that this sequence will execute. Let's take a look at the completed shipping example to see the full extent of flow control in TestStand. As you can see, we've introduced some additional if logic into this sequence, such that if any one of these test steps fails, I can actually jump to some more diagnostic test steps. I've also placed an additional sequence call to my CPU diagnostics sequence. To demonstrate how this works, let's go ahead and run this. And I'll select my power-up test to fail. Now, based on our conditional logic, we should expect to jump straight to power-up diagnostics because our power-up test step will fail. In my report, I can see that my power-up test step did fail, and the next step I execute is my power-up diagnostics, so our flow control works. So that's how you use flow control in TestStand to introduce conditional logic into your test sequences. To learn more about TestStand, go to ni.com/teststand.